We want to give a huge shout out to our sponsoring organizations, without whom we could not be here. So our presenting sponsor is Bank of America, and if you grabbed a notepad back there, Bank of America has been a tremendous partner in this Lunch and Learn series. And we're really grateful to have here for our presenting sponsor of today's event, Cigna. And I would like to invite you to come up.
So we just want to thank everyone for allowing us to partner in this event. Inclusion and diversity is really important at Cigna in educating both our employees internally, having an inclusive workforce, but also supporting the community externally is really important to us. So wanted to thank the organization for having us here. I don't have a lot of prepared remarks, but want to thank you for having us here. We're happy to support the event. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here.
I'm so sorry, everybody. You are all so far away from the microphone. We cannot hear you on Zoom.
Okay, how's this?
A little better.
Okay. Well, Brandon, thank you again. And I also want to call out the folks who helped put this specific event on. We have the Colorado Women's Chamber of Commerce, Simone, who will be our awesome moderator for the day. Benzel and Simone from Metro Deep. We have Fran with the Asian Chamber of Colorado, and Jess with East Civic, Marie with Eastside Capital, and Teresa, who couldn't be here today, but is our partner at the Commons. So all those folks really were the brain trust to make this happen, and we're really grateful to that. In addition, we have over 30 organizations across the state that have helped to make this program possible. And we will send out information after this event with a bunch of resources, a list of all of our partners and sponsors, but I don't want to cut in any further into the wisdom we have for you today. So I'm going to kick it over to Simone.
All right, well, thank you all for taking time to join us today for a really critical conversation that we've been talking about. And really the intent for our time together this afternoon is to move the dial of sorts, right? We've been talking about the importance of DEI for years. And then 2020 happened, and it became a situation where we were like, we have got to have serious conversations about DEI. And then there was this this cocktail of tragedy and awakening that really lit a fire. It ignited something within all of us to say, but wait a minute, we have to look at DEI differently. And it has to exist outside of being essentially a corporate buzzword. It has to exist outside of it being performative and checkbox. But now leaders, communities, businesses, organizations are looking and saying, how do we integrate DEI as a strategic operations plan for the purposes of progressing the sustainability of our business? We've come to the realization that DEI impacts workforce development, DEI impacts procurement, DEI impacts our ability to retain employees. DEI even impacts the fact that 2.2 million women have exited the workforce. And interestingly, they're not running back into the workforce. And so today we are here to talk about DEI, not from a space of, well, you have to do this, and then you're immediately a DEI person, but really interrogating how do you operationalize DEI so in fact that it's a part of your infrastructure, so that it's a part of your way of being, and so that it is an organic part, because it can't be this wonky thing where it's not really who you are, where it's an organic and authentic part of your values. And so we have brought together some of the finest minds for you today who really do focus on the operations piece of it as a strategy, as it being an integrative measure into your businesses. So without further ado, you all, I'm assuming you read their impressive bios. I got chills. I was like, let me bow down because y'all are the completebomb.com and I admire you. So I'm going to start this off with you all. Tell us your name, tell us what you do, but then I want you to, we're gonna go right into the panel discussion, okay? So I want you to answer the question, how do you define DEI? And because this is the first person I've made eye contact with, that's bad. If you make eye contact with me, you're gonna speak. So because you're looking me into my pretty brown eyes, Emily Shamsuddin, tell us, name, organization, and answer for us how you define DEI.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to do my best to use my speaker voice here. Let me know if on Zoom I'm not being loud enough, but my name is Emily Shamsuddin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with ESD Consulting. It is a consulting practice that I have built based on how to advance and integrate racial equity into organizational strategy. And so one of the first things that I do with clients is we spend time doing just that, which is defining what DEI is. We say it as like one thing, right? It's DEI, and we sort of say it, as Simone said, maybe it's a buzzword, but what does it actually mean? And it's important to understand that diversity, equity, and inclusion are actually three distinct frameworks that require three unique sets of strategies to actually move forward. So language is important, and the way we talk about the work and the way we understand the work is going to be integral to the way that we drive the work inside of our organizations. So the very sort of quickest way I can do a quick DEI. So diversity for me is really thinking about, it's about representation, right? It's a demographic mix of folks. Diversity really, it has its representation, super important, right? But there's limitations, right? To what just diversity, just representation alone can do. And then again, the strategies that we move forward. The one caveat that I always make when it comes to thinking about diversity is that we're talking about identity specifically. So again, we can of course make a case that we have diversity of thought and perspective anytime we want to. And in fact, if that was the lens that we worked through, any of us could make the case that we have diverse organizations. So really focusing on the identity piece is important. The way that I think about inclusion is really, again, thinking, and the definition that I use, I will say pushes, I think, the framework that some people use a little bit. You have probably heard people talk about inclusion as feeling seen and heard. That's probably a very common phrase that folks have. I talk about inclusion really as a way that we're bringing traditionally excluded folks into decision and policy making, that in a way that shares power. So when you ask me, from my experience, what it means to be seen and heard inside of an organization, it literally doesn't mean that I can walk in and someone makes eye contact with me, right? It goes beyond that. It's about the way that I have the ability to influence the agenda, right? The ability to influence the program, the ability to influence final decision making. And then we think about equity. I think about it both as a process and an outcome, right? How are we making sure that folks have what they need that is necessary in regards to access and opportunities to have what they uniquely need to thrive, and the outcome, which is that someone's identity doesn't predict their outcome. So I know that was kind of a mouthful. I hope that's okay on Zoom. But those are the ways that I think about the distinctions between diversity, equity, inclusion, and again, understanding that we need to be clear about what we're talking about so we can actually move forward the correct strategies.
Thank you. I want to go to Zoom because we never want to forget our panels that's on Zoom, and that is the incomparable Saba Camberlin. Tell us who you are, what you do, and how do you define DEI?
Thanks so much, Simone, and that's a tough act to follow, Emily. I would agree with everything you said when it comes to DEI. So we'll go to that in a second, but apologies that I couldn't be there in person with you. I have tested positive for COVID, so I did not want to spread the love to everyone in that front. So I am a partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I serve in the diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting leader role. I have the privilege of working with large global organizations all day, every day to help advance their DEI efforts, their impact, and their outcome, and really thinking about how we can increase accountability within those areas. And to build upon a little bit of what Emily also said, to us, diversity starts with representation within our organizations, and thinking about both the visible and the invisible identities and intersections of such that we have in our workplace. But at the very basic level, what we're looking at when it comes to diversity is that are we a representation and a reflection of the societies in which we serve at all levels of our organization? So when we think about equity and inclusion, really at the end of the day, the biggest marker of that is, are we seeing diversity thrive and move up through the chains within our organizations, not just to be at the entry level positions, but to see true representation at the highest, most levels. So going from the board to our executive teams and all the levels in between. From an inclusion perspective, really what we look at is a level of trust. Do people trust our organizations? Do they trust our leaders? Do they trust the processes that enable growth and progress for all people of all identities within our spheres? And from an equity perspective, similar to what Emily shared, we're looking, obviously, there's pay equity, which is the basic marker that most organizations are looking at, but looking at access to opportunities, access to sponsorship, access to connection and networks. Those are typically the markers that we see that exist for those in the majority. And we're looking at those in the most historically marginalized populations to see how is that access being equitably made available to all within our organizations to then reflect the diversity that we want to see at all levels.
Thank you. We are going to pass the mic to the one, the only, Benzel Jimerson. Tell us what you do and what does DEI mean?
So Benzel Jimerson, I'm the Chief Visionary Officer for Metropolitan Diversity and Economic Equity Partners. We don't call it that, right? Metro DEEP for short. And we focus really in youth development, entrepreneurial development, and career and workforce development. So lots inside of each of those. But really, you know, when thinking about DEI, I personally, by the way, I totally agree with everything that has been said already, so I won't go into the things that were already stated. Lots of those pieces, but we don't necessarily think about. So for example, our organization is unapologetically serves Black folks, right? However, we partner with everybody, right, who wants to have an impact inside of that community, right? So there's something to give and something to be able to do and offer towards that. So some really cool things that in other spaces can be talked about. But you know, we look at really Jedi experiences and what I called for a long time, but it just never really super caught on, is idea, right? Which adds the access. You guys have heard a little bit about that. But really, like from this justice framework, what are we willing to do, right? We're not really acting if in fact we're not making pathways for access to occur, if we're not impacting justice in a system that has been unjust for far too long, right? And then having experiences beyond just the workplace, right? Or in the workplace, meaningful experiences that are beyond a job, right? We can't really understand that diversity, right? We can't create that inclusion, right, if we don't understand and have relationship beyond a professional kind of sense, right? And so what are the experiences that we're having interpersonally, personally, right? And then as organizations. And so I'll kind of put it down there and hopefully touch on a few of those a little bit more later.
Right, next up, Fran Campbell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fran Campbell, and I'm the Executive Director of the Asian Chamber of Commerce, Colorado. And I think DEI for me, especially after what Simone said, after the 2.5 years of COVID, is really about the I, the inclusion piece. And it's not so much corporate, but community. And I am always the advocate for my AAPI community. What happened to us during COVID was non-inclusion. We were left out of so many things, even though there was anti-Asian hate going on and a lot of companies wanted to come forward to give their support. They weren't sure exactly how to give their support. So my role is to make sure that my community is included. There were so many programs, nonprofit programs and grants and opportunities out there, but the equity piece did not trickle down to my community. Now, why is that? We had to look at that and say, well, the challenge was, it isn't just language, it's culture. And when we talk about an inclusive community or an inclusive workspace, we have to understand that culture piece. Just like what you said earlier, how many of us use the injera versus a fork? That's cultural. So that requires a lot of learning on our part. It requires a lot of pride busting. You know, it requires a look at your privilege versus the community who doesn't have much. And that's how we are able in the corporate world to bring our products to those underserved communities. I work a lot with refugees and new immigrants, and even 5 generations of being here in Colorado. And those are the issues that we've been looking at for years. But like Simone said, the lens was put on us very, very brightly in the last 2 years. So that's where I'm looking at DEI.
I love that, and you couldn't have teed it up better for me. And so I want to just give you a minute to just internalize this concept that's very real. The homogeneity that we are experiencing in leadership, in the workforce, in politics, the homogeneity that we see across the line in every single thing is systematized. It is by design. Now, we are not here to dispute the truth or the false. That's indisputable. You can see it every single day. The homogeneity exists and it is by design. So then the question becomes that if in fact this is systematized, if in fact this is by design, how do all of us collectively create a new culture, to the word that Fran says, to where we are designing something that is reflective of every single face in this room? Because the homogeneity that we are experiencing in business, in politics, in leadership, and in decision-making doesn't look like this amazing lumpy stew that we're looking at today. So my question for you all as experts in this area is, how do we conscientiously create an inclusive culture? And I'm going to start with Saba.
Trying to find my unmute button, so apologies. So really at the end of the day, inclusion is a feeling. And in our work, we often use this amazing quote by Dr. Maya Angelou, which says, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So creating an inclusive culture really is all about how you make people feel, and not just in the big ways, as in, I feel valued because I'm paid well, or I feel valued because I have great benefits, but in those small everyday interactions, which frankly, that's where big decisions are also made that have direct impact on the way we're each made to feel included. So creating an inclusive culture, it's not just an organizational effort, it's the responsibility of every single member of your ecosystem. And again, we can have big, grandiose strategies in place, but if a person doesn't feel welcomed, belonging, connection, and trust in their small teams, with the peers that they work with the managers that they interact with, and if they don't feel seen and heard, and truly a sense of psychological safety to speak up and engage, then all of it is for naught. So really a thing to note on building an inclusive culture, there's no one size fits all when it comes to inclusion. The things that make me feel included may not be the same for someone else. Simone, for you, you might feel included in a different way. So to build an inclusive culture and inclusive teams, we need to first understand, frankly, what each of us need in order to feel included, and then follow through with it. So to have an inclusive culture, we have to have accountability for those actions that all of us then are in the driver's seat to enable every day, and to focus on the accountability for that. Organizations that are doing tremendous work when it comes to inclusion are actually making inclusion a skill set. So it's a part of how they hire people, how they value the performance of people, and how they actually promote people into leadership. So thinking about the inclusive behaviors that all of us can enable is really the core of how we hold each other accountable for the way that we show up every day, for the way that we make decisions every day, and for what we actually value in our leadership competency within our organizations.
Thank you. Emily, is there anything you might want to add to how we can conscientiously create inclusive culture?
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to what Saba named, you know, it's interesting because in this work, I don't know if anyone else finds this, but it is both incredibly simplistic. Like in some ways, we make something that is very complicated. We make something that can be simplistic, very complicated. At the same time, it also is very complicated. So how do we make it simplistic, right? Like there's this interesting kind of duality that I think exists in the work. So a couple of things that I will offer from a place of like real like tactical things, elements. So one is really thinking about like how many times culture, to Saba's point, is not static, right? Our organization culture is not static. It's something that should be ever evolving, ever changing, something that we're constantly adapting, right? Based on who is a part of that, who is a part of that ecosystem. And so a couple of things I think are important to at least begin a conversation is like, can you actually even identify what your culture is? And if the way that you identify it, is it the same way that others would identify it? How much time do we actually spend strategically thinking about the type of culture that we have created inside of our businesses and organizations? With that, I think a lot about something very simple, which is like feedback. What does feedback look like in your organization, in your business? If feedback is not happening at all levels, then that's usually an indication that people don't trust that they can actually give it. Or maybe you're not asking for it, whatever it is. So it's kind of it's a very simplistic way to think about what feedback looks like, right? Because feedback, again, is an indication, at least from my perspective, around trust. Can I actually give difficult, hard feedback to my superior, right? To my boss? Can it be taken then into consideration, right? Can I trust that to happen? So really assessing that, I think, can be helpful. The other thing, just two things I'll say quickly to pass it on is, this is kind of a big one, but learn how to manage defensiveness. Period, and across the board. So whether you're getting tough feedback about some element of your business, or you're actually getting feedback because you dropped a microaggression and someone feels like they want to tell you about that, right? Figure out what it means for you to manage defensiveness when you do in fact receive feedback, because that is a signal to everybody else whether that feedback will in fact be taken in earnest and good faith, and whether or not it will be acted upon. And the other thing that I would just name high level is do your own work, right? Invest and educate around the ways that you as an individual grow in this work, because that has a direct reflection on the way that you are then showing up inside of your business, and kind of the values and the things that you're bringing inside and promoting inside of the business as well. But
no, I love that. And I think some key pieces of it that really kind of impact all of us at a leadership level or an influencer level is how do we take that from the place that we sit in our organizations as leaders, influencers, and move it along. And there's some words that we kind of use, right? So how many of you have heard the word allyship? It's a good word. It starts with an A, first letter of the alphabet. That's cool. How many of you have heard the word accomplice? And I'm not talking about like what, you know, went down at the bank where there was a getaway driver there, you know what I mean? I'm talking about like accomplice. How many of you are familiar with that word? Not so many. And so when we talk about driving culture, progressing culture, I think it's important that we understand those words and the difference in the nomenclature and how that drives culture. So I'm going to pass this to my good friend Benzel and just kind of ask, what is allyship? And then on the progression and evolution, how do you move allyship to accomplishship?
First off, next time I do a panel with you, I'm bringing my dictionary. Love vocabulary. I'm writing this one down. I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna find it. You don't want me to do that, Jason? All right. So just starting with a kind of a quick analogy. You know, I think a lot about, I love the ocean. It's one of my favorite bodies of water, right? And I think that oftentimes there's like when it comes to understanding like what it really is between allyship to accomplice, right, is, you know, sometimes, and even doing this work overall, right, of DEI, sometimes there's a fear that something that we'll lose something, right, if in fact someone else gains something, right? But when you think about the ocean, it doesn't matter. If you go to the ocean with a spoon and take out some water, doesn't care, right? If you go to the ocean with a dump truck and take some water out, it doesn't care, right? And whether we take an entire ship, right? It just, there's an abundance there. And I think that the same thing is true of power, right? That there's an abundance of it, and a rising tide raises all ships, right? So just kind of keeping that in. And so, you know, for me, like everybody needs to be comfortable with wherever your starting place is, right? And there are some absolute tools. We'll make sure that Deborah has in the follow-up email that, you know, some assessments, right? Like, where am I at? Sometimes you can check in with yourself and your heart, right? And, you know, there's also, there are tools that help to give you that truth, right? And, you know, we have to check in on where are we at? Where am I starting this journey at, right? And so allyship to me, like, I don't personally, right? And inside of our organization, we don't necessarily look for allies, right? You still have some work to do if you're coming as an ally, right? We need accomplices. What are those accomplices, right? Accomplices are willing to take an action, right? They're willing to risk something of themselves, their reputation, something at their organization, whatever it is, right? Money, whatever it is, right? In order to have an impact, you're going to take that risk as an accomplice, right? In order to see change actually happen, right? And you do that by not being afraid of losing any power. In fact, you become more powerful.
I love that, and I think this dovetails nicely. It's interesting when you think about where we are, how we were built. When we think about business, throw tomatoes at me if you will, but business, the economy was really it's rooted in racialized capitalism. It is. God, that felt horrible to say, but it's just a crappy, crappy truth. And that racialized capitalism it's a spirit of othering. It's a spirit of exploitation. And we do it at every single level. And then it's a fear of the other. And that fear drives us to do horrific things. Hence, we have these movements that are so poignant. Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, because these are fear-based things that have happened, rooted in racialized capitalism, based on the time and place and the land that we sit on. And so as we look at workforce development, the power of creating culture, the power of being accomplices, a big wave that we're seeing is the necessity for us to be allies and accomplices to inviting immigrants into the workforce. And so I know you do a ton of work around this, Fran. And when we think about what is the workforce of the future, it is not this homogeneous thing that we're currently involved in. How do we bring this group, the immigrant group, into the workforce and serve as accomplices for them?
Thank you. I think you wrote that just for me.
I did.
That's a great question, and it still goes back to the allyship and accomplice. There were so many nonprofit groups that in 2020 and 2021 wanted to be allies of the Asian small business community. And they had made these great programs. And then they just sat back and waited for the Asian business community to come. But it's just like, if you build it, they will come. It didn't happen. Why? Because they didn't do their homework of understanding the culture, that you have to go to the new immigrant. You have to go to them and do it face to face, or even one-on-one on Zoom. but just expecting them to just come and say, oh, you guys have lots of money, we're gonna show up. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And then when we talk about retention, well, interviewing, then hiring, then retaining the new immigrant or the refugee worker, you have to let go of a lot of HR procedures that you're used to, okay? You have to let go of expecting the applicant to be looking you straight in the eye, because culturally, they don't, that's something that a lot of cultures cannot do. You know, I could do it because I was born and raised here, but my parents couldn't. You have to let go of expecting proper grammar and proper language, especially if it's written. You know, you have to let go of, yeah, the grammar piece is a big one, because even though they can translate it into English, the grammar is different. The words are in different places than what we're used to. Those are very simple building block kind of things that if we are looking to hire at the smallest level, from a restaurant to a big corporation like McKinsey, you have to be aware of those things if you want them to integrate into your business. So just saying we do all of this, we have a great allyship, we have a great program, and then just waiting for them to come, it's not going to be successful. You have to go get them. No matter, and that's not just for the Asian community, that's for any immigrant community.
I love that, and you said something that is striking. I'm sorry, you guys are probably getting a little itchy and squirmy, and it's okay, explore that trigger. That's where growth happens. When you get squirmy, when you start to get a little bit mad, that just means you're triggered, you're safe. You are in a safe and loving community. And so what you actually just really said in a very beautiful way, way better than I ever could, is that you have to explore dominant culture in your businesses, whether it's a startup. How am I starting this business with values and ideals of dominant culture, right? And how is that impacting my ability to accept other cultures and build inclusive culture? The key to that is, once you have shown a huge spotlight on the prevalence of dominant culture in everything you do, and it's everywhere, and it doesn't matter your ethnicity. Every single one of us in this room, regardless of gender, ethnicity, whatever is on that spectrum, we're all figuring out how to exist in dominant culture. Once you explore that and find ways to let go of some of those ideals, then you create room to let in. So I want us to talk about, in a perfect world, we've explored that. We've rejected that, and we've said we're rejecting dominant culture and creating inclusive culture. Job seekers are in fact looking for inclusive culture. So Slava, what are job seekers looking for as we are on this new horizon?
I think first and foremost, it's transparency, right? I think most of us, especially those of us who have been in a lot of different roles, we can kind of see through the smoke and mirrors of the performative actions that organizations may be publicly stating, and be able to actually re-interview in an interview process our organizations to really understand, is it real? Is it true? You know, what all these commitments and actions that you're stating, is it going to be meaningful to me in my career journey? You may pull out the one or two, you know, people of color who are in leadership positions to be a part of brand and marketing and messaging, but do I see someone like myself at this organization to know that there is a path for me, and that people will see me and will support me and sponsor me, so that when I'm not in the rooms where I need to be in, there'll be people speaking for me on my behalf. To go back to your point earlier, Simone, I mean, that's an accomplice, right? That's someone who is going to be active in working with me, for me, regardless of what's in it for them. And so when we look at what our organizations, you know, putting out there, I think there's a big component of it that it has to be true, it has to be trustworthy, and it has to be transparent, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So those organizations that are reporting their data unapologetically, but also reporting their strategies of how they go about achieving and closing the gap, I think those are the ones that, you know, new job seekers will look for. I think the other thing that we recently did a study, and we found 47% of Gen Z, people who are entering the workplace prioritize purpose over pay. So it's not just about how much you're going to pay me. It's really, am I going to find purpose in the work that I do? And do my personal values align with your organization's values to really create good in the world, or create good for me as I move through my career journey? So I think, again, to kind of sum up, people are looking for transparency. They're looking for trustworthiness, which doesn't always mean talking about all the good things. It also talks about where there are challenges and how all people who are joining the company can have a role to play to advance progress in those areas. And it comes down to really having a purpose that goes beyond just making money and advancing the goals of a few. It goes to really aligning with people's personal purpose, and also creating mechanisms by which you can see progress in the good that we all can do in society.
Love that. Do any of you have anything to add as far as what job seekers are looking for from employers?
I think that subject of trust, that's a huge subject, very general, because trust encompasses so many things. Trust means not just today, but later on down the line, that this person or this company is going to help me grow. Or are they just going to have me at this cubicle sitting in a space and never talk to me? There's no human growth there, or even career growth there. Trust is also finding out who you could go to with your work issues, especially if you are somebody from an underrepresented community. Is there somebody here that will understand what I am going through within this job? Yeah, that's my.
Just a real simple example that I would give is, we use the entrepreneurial operating system, or EOS, where we open up our meetings, and depending on the size of your organization, obviously you have to kind of like figure out how does this actually work. But we start with a segue, right? And we're asking each other, right? How are you doing, right? How are you being personally, professionally, and how can you be supported, right? And just little things like that, right? Start to bring in what everyone else is talking about, right? It's how we start to connect. It's how purpose starts to get created, and opens a space for us to be more and more vulnerable. And it's tough as a leader, right? Because we have to make ourselves vulnerable, right? And that's an absolute no, right? We don't cross that line, right, in our work. But I will say it is a challenge, because my staff will come to me and will challenge a lot, right? And so how do you balance that? How do you go through? That means like I had to do my own work as well as, right? And figure out what does that scaling of my leadership look like? What work do I internally need to do so that that's not offensive to me, but that is felt as love, so that we can grow the purpose and the impact of the organization ultimately.
People are giving me softballs. This is the easiest panel to work with. So newsflash, operationalizing DEI is not a systems migration. You know what I mean? Like there's no CVS file that you can send to this person that then puts it in and scrubs the data. Like, did you know that? Like there's no CVS file for this. In fact, it is very complex head, heart, and systems work. And I don't mean systems. There's no CVS file, y'all. And then the further you get into it, the grimier and grittier it is. And then you're screwing up. You're saying the wrong thing. You're doing the wrong thing. You're hurting sometimes someone's feelings and you apologize for it and you come back together, maybe teary-eyed, you laugh, you hug, and you grow and you build. Because guess what we're trying to do? We're trying to restructure something that none of us have a booklet for or a CVS file for. We're trying to retrain our brains. We're trying to reprogram ourselves. The whole while we're trying to impact the system, the whole while we're trying to achieve these KPIs. And that is complex. And so I say that to say that it requires an allocation of resources monetarily. It requires an allocation of time personally and as your team. And it requires continual evolution and growth, which means that, you know what, maybe CAST worked for me 3 months ago, and that was my Bible to really understand things. But guess what? Maybe now I got to switch stuff up with a little Robert Greene, the law of human nature. And maybe I have to talk to some other people and figure out this stuff because I too am sharpening my toolkit through ongoing learning, meeting new people, conquering fears, and just challenging myself. So I want to ask every single panelist, how are you keeping your toolkit sharp? Is it a book? Is it a podcast? Is it a person that you call, a service? I'm going to start with Denzel.
One, I believe that like you run into people for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. And so I'm always open to anyone I meet. Like, 5-year-olds teach me stuff about myself. And so I'm listening to that, right? That's one. The white supremacy culture, that PDF or whatever body of work that happened through Tim Okun, I thought was one of the best ever, and I actually walked around with it in my back pocket for about a month to just check myself, right, and then gave it to everyone on the team, right, so that they could do the same. And that, because even in my organization, and it's all Black, we there's things of like the culture that we brought in because of the society that we live in. And that's what made that such a powerful piece of work to me, because it doesn't matter, right? Like, it looks at the societal aspect, and it's not an attack on any one individual race or whatever. It just is what it is. So that's one other thing that I would say. If you all want to understand Black culture a lot, right? And there's a book called Homegoing by Yagasi. Whew, that's all I'll say about that.
What is it?
Yagasi, Yaagagysi, and the book is called Homegoing. What's that? Homegoing by Yagasi. In that, it took away me ever being a victim.
Fran, what about you?
How do I keep it sharp? I get so angry when I have to do this, and I get so uncomfortable when I have to do this, but I have to see other people's point of view. I just want my point of view to be the only point of view. I'm human like that, but but I can't do that. I can't do that, not just because of the work I am, but because I'm trying to be a good human being. So I have to listen to somebody who may hate everything that I'm doing. I have to listen to a small business owner who doesn't think I'm helping them, and why. I have to listen to an elected official that I totally disagree with, but they are an elected official. So that's how I keep these things sharp, is I force myself to be on the other side, to stand in somebody else's shoes, to really look at it, even though I hate doing it.
I mean, I think that we are, we're living in a day and time where, y'all can Google some books, and there's an endless amount of resources, right, that are out there. I think there's two things for me in particular that always come up when I think about sort of sharpening my tool. One is I like to bring myself back down, speaking of five-year-olds, to like toddler me, which is, how do I have a constant interrogation about what I believe to be true, right? So all the things. Whether I'm looking at my own training that I developed, I'm having a constant interrogation of what is different, what needs to be improved. Am I speaking of dominant culture, like a constant interrogation of like, well, who told me I had to do it this way? Right? Why do I think that that's why I have to do it this way? What else is possible? So I think there's like a constant interrogation, which honestly can be a little exhausting sometimes, but like being in that space where I'm willing to do that and I'm willing to grow and change. The other point for me that is always helpful as a place to start is recognizing the places in which I hold privilege are the places in which I have the greatest blind spots and biases. So for me, there has to be a real intention around exploring those elements of myself, right? So again, thinking about the way that I am showing up in the world. So those for me are sort of the two kind of more broadly speaking ways that I think about what that means. The last thing I will just say, I know folks know this, but like time, I mean, really, I know that sounds so simple, but like this requires us to invest ourselves as much as it requires us to invest our resources. And so how are you building in actual time? And if you don't have time to read a book, y'all, I get it. Don't read a book, but there's a bunch of articles. There's a bunch of shorter versions of things that you can read. But like that investment of personal time is something that like you just have to figure out, right? You have to figure out how to do that and how to commit to it.
Saba, same question for you. How are you keeping your toolkit sharp?
Yeah, so I will share two very tactical resources that I think are very accessible for everyone who's in the room and virtually available. And then I'll share just something personally I do. So first, Fortune Magazine has a great newsletter or like a listserv that you can be a part of, which is called Race Ahead. And regularly, I will say of all the different things that come into my email inbox, that is one that I stop and I make time to read because it is important, it's powerful, it's enlightening, it challenges the status quo, and it brings, especially from a corporate and a business lens, really relevant content to bear. So I would say it's free, it's publicly available, join that and gain the knowledge that they share there. The other one that's a little bit more local here in Colorado, there is a great group of companies that are coming together regularly. It's with Colorado Inclusive Economy. And if you go to their website, which is inclusiveeconomy.us, there are some phenomenal resources that are available for anyone to use. They've got a toolkit. Small businesses, large businesses can become members. They have regular forums that they host where here in Colorado, companies are coming together to really share knowledge, share resources, the lessons learned, the good, the bad, and the ugly that we can all leverage to advance our efforts. So those are two tactical things that I think all of us can do beyond the Google searches and all that. There is so much available out there right now. But I think for me personally, to keep my toolkit fresh, Emily, to kind of echo what you said, I'm constantly challenging myself, and specifically on my teams, I'm challenging myself to say, who have I not connected with? So not really going to the same sources of truth that I'm comfortable with, but to really push myself to figure out like who I've left out, right? So I'll look at my phone logs at times, or who's saved as a favorite in my phone, and say, is there a team member who I'm not giving the same level of access to as others may have? And I should be purposeful and to go and reach out and connect and gain their perspective and find out why, one, I've not been connecting regularly with them, and maybe why I haven't heard from them. Maybe there's a block there that I need to, as an inclusive leader, remove so that they feel better access to me as a leader. So I think challenging myself to really evaluate who I've let in, but more importantly, who I've left out, so that I can go and gain those broader perspectives and really make sure that I don't have, my blinders on, and I'm looking at my blind spots regularly to keep trying to grow and learn as well. The last thing I will say is to open the door to two-way bi-directional feedback. So while as a leader, I'm often in the position to give feedback to those that report to me, really creating a psychologically safe space so that people also feel comfortable in giving me feedback and ways that I can continue to grow and improve. And I think that takes very purposeful actions and to create that culture where people feel comfortable to give that feedback without fear of retribution. And I think as leaders, that's something we should really work towards. And what we gain and learn from that is probably the biggest gift we can get.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to Q&A because I feel like some of you all are itching to ask our experts a question. But before we do that, I want to just kind of issue a challenge to everybody here and then all of our friends virtually. We easily divorce ourselves from issues by saying it's not my work, it's their work. Or we divorce ourselves from causes and focal points by being like, well, I would have done it. I would have picked that piece of trash up off the floor, but I know somebody's going to come behind me and get it. And so I think when we're doing this work and building this and changing this infrastructure, we have to own that every single one of us are equity practitioners. Even if you're not the chief diversity officer, you have to own that you are on the path to doing equity work. Because then that takes the excuse away for not doing it, right? You can't say, well, I'm an individual contributor, so I wanted to, but I didn't do it because that's not my workflow. So really quickly, I want you to turn to your neighbor, whoever is closest to you, if you got a couple up, and I want you to introduce yourself. But I want you to try on a different title. I want you to say, hey, I'm Simone, and I do equity work. And then people in the chat, I want you to put in the chat, just do a quick intro. Say, hello, my name is Simone, and I do equity work. I want you to try that title on because it's going to shift ownership to you. So take 30 seconds, introduce yourself to your neighbor with your new title. I'm gonna bring it back in. I'm gonna bring it back in. I know, no, I love it. So just somebody really quickly, how did that feel to try that on and take ownership of being somebody that is invested in equity work? How did that feel? Good. Yeah. Try that on. Because again, a piece of this is rebranding yourself, right?
I'm sorry, I'm just going, she said awkward, which I thought was a good answer.
It's interesting.
Yeah, very awkward.
That's good. That means you're doing it right. Good. We gotta be hella uncomfortable if we in fact hope to make change, right? And that is what every single one of us are doing. If in fact you want to see my purpose is women's advancement and creating equity for women in work, I do equity work. If you want to see a particular community progress and you're passionate about that, you do equity work. If you want to diversify your team, if you want to diversify your sales team, guess what? You do equity work. You came here because you do equity work. And so try that on, because that is going to then make you the owner of creating progress. So we're going to open it up, Q&A. We are also inclusive of everyone that's joining us virtually. Oh my gosh, look at the chat. The chat is buzzing with people that do equity work. So we're going to open it up for questions. Just rapid fire go.
If you have a question, I will say it will not
Come on up, Megan Carabello. She is our Chief Marketing Officer at the Colorado Women's Chamber of Commerce.
But I also do.
Can one of the panelists please repeat the question?
So I'm here to ask my question. Can you hear me? Okay, good. No, I'm in marketing and communications, and I oftentimes am tasked with being the communicator for an organization who wants to recognize days of celebration or months of celebration. And then I oftentimes want to run those things by people who identify within those communities. And then I always wonder if that's an awkward conversation or how to approach those conversations, you know, authentically. And then,
Thank you.
I, I love this. By being authentic, that's the bottom line to all of this, right? Like if I am, you know, if I'm asking something, I can feel you as well as I can hear you, right? And, you know, and if someone comes with the authentic curiosity and authentic wanting to make a impact, to get it right, to understand it better, I'll accept that, period, right? If it's not, right, and it's a check the box, I can feel that, and then it's not okay.
The other thing that I would add on top of that is only ask if you're actually willing to accept the feedback that is given. Right? So many times, so many times we have folks who will come and say, hey, what do you think about this little thing? How's this feel? And then if we say, not great, and it doesn't feel right, or this approach wasn't correct, and then you do it anyway, you're going to break trust. And we've talked already how important that is. So I think that's like the one caveat in addition to like that authenticity that you bring to the conversation. Don't ask unless you're willing to hear the feedback and then make adjustments that might be necessary based on that feedback.
I actually had an incident like that where a big company wanted to have a kind of an Asian celebration, and they had put out pamphlets and brochures and little name tags and everything. And then they checked with us. And they said, whoa, no, that, you know, that may not be seen right, that may not be seen as appropriate. And they realized the mistake they made, and they pulled back everything and redid it. This is a huge company. But I think before you go to all the expense of putting out all of that, ask first. Yeah. And like he said, yeah, we could tell when it's just a box that's being checked. We can't.
Simone, I'll just add just one quick thing here. I mean, I was told very early in my career, and it was a piece of advice that has always stuck with me, is call people when you don't need something so you can call them when you do. And when you've got a crisis on hand, or when you've got something really, you know, critical that you need to communicate, that's not the time to call someone for advice. Build those relationships early, create those pathways for communication early, leverage, you know, your employee resource groups if you have them, but do it in a way, again, that's authentic, but do it not just when you need something, do it when you, to really truly create those authentic channels for feedback, so that when you really do need it, it's there, and you're not just starting from scratch at that moment.
Huge. And I know that like Deborah can call me anytime, right? Can call anytime. And so I completely lost my point. Go ahead.
It was going so well.
It was good.
So I have a question from the chat, which is, how do business leaders and companies explore all of their systems to create an environment where everyone has equitable access to opportunity and progress and resources?
Say that one more time.
What can organizations do to ensure that they're exploring that all of their systems, not just hiring, development, and promotion, all systems to create an environment where everyone has equitable access to opportunity to create progress?
Hire one of these wonderful people here. That's a big question. I mean, it's a big question. Maybe you all can have a more simple, or like some kind of answer that fits in there. But, you know, if you want that to exist and you don't feel like it already is, right? Or you're already moving in that direction. By the way, I remembered my point, which is like, you have to do your own work, right? And people who have done their own work to some level and degree, like, it's much easier to have a conversation with, right, around all of that, or are willing to do that. But yeah, that's a big question, and it takes help, you know, by professionals in order to do so.
Simone, I can add in here. Oh, sorry, Emily, did I interrupt you?
No.
Okay. I was going to say, the data doesn't lie. And if you start first by unlocking the stories that exist in your data, when we do work with companies, and a huge part of my role is to go into a lot of organizations and assess, right? Assessment is the first place. We start with the data stories first, because you can actually start to see the inclusion stories and the equity stories really play out through the patterns that are evidenced in the data. And frankly, that's where we want to start, because the data doesn't lie, and you can't say, well, no, this was just one person who had this experience. When you start to see those patterns, you can actually point to, here are where the systems are breaking down. So if you start to see, that, hey, I literally this morning, I was talking with an organization where they're like, we're doing a great job hiring a lot of diversity, but we're not sure why by the time someone gets to the director level, there's no diversity left. And it's like, well, let's start unpacking the data and see where the drop off point is. And when then you double click on that and start to actually talk to the people and understand what the real experiences that they're having, sometimes you'll find that the system and the process actually is there, but it's the people who are enabling the systems that are, leaving people out of the process. Other times, you've got very inclusive leaders, but the processes are broken down. So I would say start with the data, listen to the stories in your data, then double click on those and actually talk to the people who are either benefiting or not benefiting from the systems that are in place, and then fix those. It may sometimes not require a full overhaul, but really pinpoint into where you have hotspots within that data set to really understand what's going on. And it's actually sometimes simpler than it's made out to be, because the data stories are already there. It's just a matter of unlocking how you get access and insights from them.
And I think too, where we kind of start to get wrong, go a little bit askew, is that you do have to parse out the data. So you can hear a report and you have to ask as leaders for that parsed out data. Because I can say to you all, we've only had 10% attrition in our company. And then you're like, well, that's great. It's down from 32 from last year. Then you need to say, who's in that 10%? Uh-oh, it's Black women. So then essentially we've lost every Black woman in our workforce. So in fact, our attrition rate should not be celebrated. It should be further interrogated to see who in fact is leaving, because perhaps we don't have a holistic attrition problem. Perhaps in fact, we do have an issue in our workforce where we cannot retain Black women, and then we need to follow that line. So that's why when we look at pay equity, Latina women will not be at pay parity until December 8th of this year. So they worked an entire 12 months longer than a white man has. So at the point that white women are brought to parity, we can't say women are being paid equitably. That in fact is not true, and we can't celebrate that. We can't celebrate pay equity until Latina women are paid equitably, because they're no longer having to work an additional 12 months. And then we can use the language and say, now we're here to say women holistically are being paid equitably. And so we have to just retrain our brains to look at the data, parse it out, and ask those questions like, what does this attrition rate mean? Let's follow that line. And then you know what you need to actually fix, recreate, or rebuild. Other questions?
Who's on your board and your executive team as well? That's another big one. There's plenty of qualified folks.
There's a question.
I was just going to add on to what you just said. So I'm Janelle Johnson. I'm with MSU Denver and the Colorado STEM ecosystem. I love what you just said. And for me, what's really helpful for that concept is looking for disproportionality in the data. So like any numbers that we're looking at should be reflective of the larger community. So like if we're looking at our company, look at the demographics. Well, if there's some work to do, but then look at the different structures and leadership positions. And so that's a really helpful kind of red flag. Like it should be generally the same, and it's really skewed, then you got some work to do.
It's a hard one for my community because there is no data. There isn't any data like that. That kind of data is not kept for new immigrant and refugee communities. Maybe that's something that we could change. from the top down.
And if I could just offer for any folks that are working with smaller businesses or organizations, I think one of the things that's really important is to make sure that you're being data informed rather than data driven. Because oftentimes in those smaller ecosystems, like I don't know how many times y'all I have been asked to give feedback and I am the only Black person in the org. And it's like, they know it's me. They know I said it, right? And so I have to be thoughtful, right? About, can I trust, again, that I can honestly give this feedback knowing that I don't have any cover here, right? People are going to be able to probably pretty easily identify who said that piece. So it's important to also make sure when you talk about the double clicking, you talk about that interrogation, is to make sure you're still asking those really hard questions about maybe who was left out, right? Who maybe isn't able to give a really honest and informed feedback or whatever way you're collecting the data. So I just really want to offer that because I see that show up in organizations where they'll do a survey and they're like, oh, look, our 2 people of color said things are great. And then they take that and they believe that then to be full truth. And the reality is that it might be true for those 2 people. It doesn't, 1, necessarily mean that 1 is true. 2, it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the truth for all people of color who are going into your organization. So just wanted to offer that like smaller nuanced perspective around data too.
And it's sad that you have to say that as a woman, as a Black, right? Like as a Black woman, that you have to say that, right? I personally could care less what people think about my feedback, right? And that's like a privilege, right? That I hold as being a man. And those are things like, if that kind of reality exists anywhere around your organization, there's work to do.
Yeah, I think we're kind of sort of at time. Are there any questions in the chat? Because I think you're supposed to be able to network. Are there any other questions out here? Okay, well, good. So are people, everyone in the room that does equity work, if you do equity work, raise your hand. Network amongst yourselves, equity practitioners.
Thank you so much, Simone and our incredible panelists. There's still lots of food, so network, talk, best practices, really hard lessons learned, all that's really good stuff. There's a survey in your panels for folks online, so you should have gotten a link to take the survey. So that's, we really do look at this data to find out what we're doing well, how we can do better. So please take a couple minutes to fill out the survey in your folder or online. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good job, team.
We have to do like moderate. I think we should do like some cross.
Thank you so much. How are you feeling?